Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Amongst this week's news items we have a further development with regards to diet soft drink or soda and aspartame. An interesting article talking about medical misinformation by physicians in the United States of America. The first pig kidney transplants to humans that are there for life effectively. The surprising value of what seems to be a relatively useless rock. The newly discovered world that challenges what we know about planet formation, and NASA's Ingenuity rover, more specifically helicopter, flies again after a unscheduled landing. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with diet soft drink or soda. Depending on where you are in the world, you might even call it pop. But despite that, recent news has many people questioning its safety, particularly if it relies on the use of aspartame. Ignoring the overall question about the safety of aspartame, other research indicates that there may be concerns about it related to things like stroke and dementia. Neurological disorders like that are, well, to be quite blunt about it, relatively hard to prove, and this is why papers published over recent years tend to be flashes in the pan. They pop up, they make a big splash, and then they die off as there's unable to be substantiated proof coming from them. This is why a blog article from the Skeptical Raptor is at least somewhat useful. They go through one of these articles and talk about the main takeaways and, to be quite blunt about it, why the research itself isn't necessarily as substantial as the publication would have you think it is. To be quite blunt about it, given the sample size of about 2,888 individuals who were older, over 45 years of age, and that they had a relatively large cohort of those who were over 60, there are issues. Notably that if you analyze and torture the data long enough, you will eventually pull out some variables that are related. In this instance, diet, drink, and neurological diseases. In fact, arguably, this very point is best highlighted by the same group's publication from only a month or two earlier, where they found that consuming sugared beverages, which is effectively the opposite of diet soft drink or soda, had the same sort of effects. So, damned if you do and damned if you don't. Or, as is perhaps more witty in terms of this context, lies, damned lies, and statistics. Worse yet in the context of this study is that it was all done via surveys, and unfortunately surveys do have big problems, particularly in this circumstance where, to be quite blunt about it, the individuals responding may be actively trying to please the researchers by trying to report what they think the researchers want to see, not what's actually happening. And this obviously raises issues. There's also not a lot of, let's say, substantive evidence that the cohort examined is representative of anything and everything else that they could be trying to extrapolate this out to. Of course, this does apply in particular places such as Florida, and while this isn't an example of Florida man, it's very close. The 35-year-old woman doused herself in Diet Mountain Dew in an effort to destroy forensics evidence, thereby depriving law enforcement of, well, that evidence. Yeah, reason law enforcement wanted blood was to test whether or not the blood found on a knife next to the victim was from her. Given that the victim was found being bludgeoned and stabbed, and that the, let's say, accused was found carrying a hammer and knife, it seems fairly cut and dry. The attempt to hide the forensic evidence by washing themselves in Mountain Dew was, well, not really that surprising. It's Florida. It could also have been a result of misinformation, and this is somewhat more prevalent in the US according to at least one study this week. The research was looking at the spread of misinformation, particularly on social media by physicians. Before we get into the details of this, it is worth us pointing out that this is a mixed method study. That is something that uses qualitative research methods like surveys, interviews, and similar, arguably soft methods, and then there's specific data-derived methods This is things like statistics. The researchers have used what is arguably a rather crap method, and there's no other way to describe this. They began by using the CDC's definitions for things like misinformation, which that's not really a problem. It's what followed afterwards. They supposedly used structured searches of social media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and so on. They also looked at news sources like the New York Times and NPR. Now, structured searches are all well and good, but the problem with this is that, well, manyfold, but the most significant is that depending on who, what, where, and why, the language used may not fit within structured searches. Secondary to that is that the very nature of social media is that it generally involves a very individual interaction between people with relatively little discoverability until you have triggered the system in such a way that it suggests these to you. And that's a problem. And why we think the qualitative approach to this is not only soft, but most likely inappropriate. It would be better if they had used the internal data from these organizations, as organizations and businesses like, say, YouTube or Facebook allow researchers to have access to the back system and scrape data. This lets them figure out what their users are doing and, to a certain extent, publish on this. The Cambridge Analytica scandal is an example of exactly that. There's also the, let's say, oddity that although they specifically state there are 5 platforms, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Parler, and YouTube, they only write on 4 of these major platforms. So that means that there's a particular, let's say, cherry picking of their sources to analyze this. And then there's the qualitative analysis of each of the, well, posts, videos, etc. that were used. The researchers, let's call them, did find at least some interesting results, even if we can't necessarily extrapolate these out to anything other than this individual study. They found that there were 52 physicians across 28 different specialties throughout the US that were spreading, in their words, misinformation. This related to things like medication, masks, vaccines, and a variety of conspiracy theories. 80% of them posted vaccine misinformation. Nearly 80% propagated information that covered different groups, so this could be masking, vaccines, conspiracy theories, etc. And nearly 40% used the same sort of process to spread across multiple platforms. The most common, let's say, elements of their misinformation was vaccine safety and effectiveness, spreading medical treatments that weren't evidenced, or that masking was not an effective method. This is then concluded to be a widespread example of misinformation spreading on social media. There are concerns here that they began their entire study by looking at news sources and then switched solely to social media, which speaks to the issues around their method in that they've effectively started with a control or comparison and then switched to only the single side of it with no comparison to make whatsoever. And that's a problem, and why this study, along with the other issues already mentioned, are a major concern and why it is arguably very flawed. In further developments with regards to this, and an example of why that research isn't necessarily reliable, is the, formerly Dr. Sherry Tenpenny. Sherry Tenpenny was, until this week, a doctor. They no longer have a medical license after the state medical board suspended it. This is an individual who is, let's say, notorious. Notorious because she claimed that vaccines were making people magnetic, amongst a range of other, let's say, spurious and interesting claims. To be quite blunt, it's rather hard to imagine anybody could take her seriously based on that alone, let alone the other things she's said, but nonetheless, it is what it is, and her continued dissemination of bad information and ultimately the practices she implemented as a result means that she's no longer a doctor, and this is exactly what happens to doctors who are, in this instance, not practicing evidence-based medicine. something the previous study should have been applying, in that, are they spreading something that is evidence-based, and more importantly, are they currently under censure from their licensing board, as a lot of this is, if not publicly available enough that you know what's happening if you do some searching. Depending on how committed Tenpenny is to her position, let's say, she may or may not get her license back at this point. In order for it to be reinstated, she will first have to recognize that it has been revoked or suspended, and apply for it to be reinstated. She'll need to pay the fines for the issues that have already been, let's say, convicted, that she'll need to get a certificate that she will cooperate with the board's investigation of her behaviour, and this is something that she's not done so far, and that she'll need to provide evidence of fitness to resume practicing, given that, well, to be quite blunt about it, she hasn't really practiced in her field for more than 2 years, and as a result, may or may not be able to do so without retraining. Of course, that doesn't mean that once they've completed their investigation, that the license won't be suspended or revoked entirely and permanently. In medical news that's, well, actual medical news and slightly more promising, we have a transplant of a pig kidney into a human. Now, you may have heard of pigs being used for things like liver failure, but rarely is it that the entire organ is transplanted, if at all, and that's because there is a problem with, well, pig kidneys and other organs for that matter. They have a particular protein within them. This protein stimulates the immune system and basically leads to organ rejection. This is where genetically modified pigs have been in development for a while now. The researchers at the University of Alabama have been developing them, and this is an example of exactly that. The key here is that the genetic modification removed the protein marker in the pig's kidney, and for that matter, other parts of the pig entirely, that meant the body would reject it, and so when it was transplanted into a brain-dead patient in this case, it was able to not only function by removing creatine and creating urine, but also not be rejected. This opens a significant pathway for, well, resolving a massive shortage of donors and, in this instance, donor kidneys. This creates an arguable case opening the door for liver transplants, arguably the lungs, heart, if not hearts, at least valves, and other parts of the pig that could also raise issues around the ethics for those who have either a religious or cultural objection to those animals. There is also another issue that this is fundamentally a proof of concept, and they'll now need to get the various approvals, which could take years if not decades to happen. That doesn't mean that the xenotransplants won't happen that much sooner, and it could be that within maybe a few years we could begin seeing this happen. But just remember, xenotransplant is very different to a xenomorph transplant. Slightly more immediate and promising news is that of a 3D printed nose, although at the moment the nose is only on someone's arm, which does sound somewhat Frankenstein-like, but this is neither our work nor is our flag a plain white sheet. The way this works is that the individual had lost part of their face due to cancer, which sucks. There's no better way to describe it from someone who's not involved. What they then did was to 3D print what is fundamentally a scaffold. This scaffold plays the role of cartilage in your nose under normal circumstances. What the researchers and surgeons have done is to then place this 3D printed scaffold under skin cut away from the arm, and that this skin is then folded over and molded around the 3D printed cartilage replacement. By doing this, they're able to keep it completely attached to the individual. It's their own skin. It's still given a vascular supply, as it's, well, still attached to them, and it is their own skin. Then, once the new graft had developed properly and appeared to be, for lack of a better word, ready to be grafted, which took about 2 months, they were able to take the nose, let's say, and in a 6-hour surgery, graft it onto their face and basically replace their nose. Recovery did take about 10 days and about 3 weeks of antibiotics, but it appears to have worked. The issue with this, and it's the important part to it, is the cartilage replacement that was 3D printed is not based on any of the generic filaments or similar available for 3D printing. Instead, it used a compound called hydroxyapatite. This is a mineral that's found in bones and teeth. As you can imagine, this is much more similar to cartilage, and as a result, the body is far less likely to try and reject it. And that's the key here. Using naturally occurring materials from the body is much better than using something synthetic, as the body generally tries to remove any foreign material as quickly as it can, and in this instance, it causes a lot of damage to the local tissue. That damage, in the case of a graft, like this case study, almost always leads to rejection, and that rejection means not only do you have significant scarring on the arm of the individual, but they don't have the nose that they were trying to get. Fortunately, the individual is, well, not only happy, but can smell and do other things that allows them to return to a mostly normal life. In a news that's based on something less clear-cut, it's a mystery rock that apparently is worth a lot of money. The rock is a roughly 10 kilogram or 22 pound mass that was at a local farm. The farmer used this relatively innocuous object as a doorstop for decades. However, this doorstop apparently is incredibly valuable, and surprisingly so. A solid mass of, well, meteorite in this case as it was identified, was worth $75,000. How many times have you had a $75,000 object just used to randomly prop doors open? The reason it's valuable is, well, several-fold, the biggest being its, well, constitution. It's a iron-nickel meteorite, and it has a very large percentage of nickel, at about 12%. The other benefit to this for this individual is that the way they came to possession of it. They came to own it by virtue of it apparently being part of the property they bought, and therefore, when he bought the property, that he was given the meteorite. He was effectively given a $75,000 valuable object. Next we have similar news that's of an extraterrestrial nature, although this time disproving the extraterrestrial life. Uri Geller was recently sharing photos that prove aliens exist. The problem with these photos? They were from the X-Files TV series. And the fans of said series very quickly identified what those photos were of, which is somewhat funny. Uri Geller is well known for his boon spending and similar, let's say, pseudoscientific nonsense. Better yet, it would appear that the image itself was debunked using Twitter, or now X's, community notes method, which means this was very clearly recognized by a large number of individuals and then, well, described as such, further embarrassing someone who has tried to claim that their power was given to them by, well, aliens. In further extraterrestrial news, we have the planet that could challenge our understanding of how planets form. It's called TOI 4860b, a very fantastical name for a very fantastical planet. You can find this particular lump of space rock 260 light years away, so this is no small feat to be able to figure out where it is and what it is. It is a very small gas planet, however, and it's about the size of Saturn, if not a little bit smaller. Where this gets distinct and different from other gas giants in our solar system, and others for that matter, is the star it orbits, or more accurately, its orbit around the star. Each orbit takes just over 1.5 days. Yeah, this is not only incredibly fast, but it's a very large gas giant circling a relatively small star, and that the whole planet itself, for some reason, wasn't sucked into the star when the, well, system at the time was forming. The reason this is important is that when you look at the formation of most systems out there, you start with a star in the center, and this is generally where most of the material within the system has aggregated. Planets progressively out from there, tend to have less and less of the mass that made the system. For example, while Jupiter is massive, it is also a gas giant, compared to something like Mars or Earth, which are far less of a gas planet. This is also one reason why they're significantly smaller. This is a gas giant right next to a star, however, and that's unusual and raises questions about the modelling we have, so far at least, for the development of various planets. In further astronomical news, we have, Mariner's trick to navigating the moon. The moon hasn't really been explored or visited by humans in decades now, and this is going to be a problem, as the plan is hopefully to return to the moon relatively soon. Most modern humans, however, are going to struggle with that, as there is no GPS equivalent for the moon at present, and just about every current living human who's in a position to go to space really hasn't lived without GPS for a very long time. This is where Hungarian researchers have found a way to be able to translate our modern GPS or equivalent sort of system to the moon itself. The Eötvös Loránd University found that by using a Fibonacci sphere, they could do exactly that. It takes the idea of Earth and applies it to the moon, but neither Earth nor the moon are perfect spheres, and so the slight squishing of the top and bottom of each body in the space leads to the sides bulging out just slightly. This creates a not perfectly spherical shape, despite what most models would show. The reason this is important is that since the middle of the moon, and for that matter Earth, bulges out just slightly compared to the top and bottom, which is squished down just slightly, the Fibonacci sphere accommodates that and allows for more accurate plotting of the various directions and places on the lunar surface. And if you're going to send people there, whether for exploration or theoretically colonization as with Mars, you're going to need to account for this in any GPS or GPS equivalent for the moon. And Mars eventually. Next, and the final piece of astronomical news we have for you is that NASA has been able to get Ingenuity to fly again, after what they describe as an unscheduled landing. Most of the rest of us would simply call this a crash landing, but NASA being NASA, you have to be technically correct even if you're not accurately correct. The flight was its 54th, which is considerably more than what it was ever expected to achieve, and this is partially achieved by virtue of the fact that it continues to be powered long after they expected the power to expire. Each of the flights are, however, relatively short. For example, they can be as little as 25 seconds or as much as 136 seconds, so somewhere between half a minute and just over 2 and a bit minutes. The final news item we have for you is an interesting article in the Evening Standard by Richard Dawkins, and it's all about the disconnect between the different sides of the culture war, and notably the issues around a use of language on one side versus the other is then able to lead to accusations of things like hate, hypersensitivity, and various other issues that make it impossible to effectively communicate. This is a problem when you're either trying to understand the opposing side's argument, or when you're trying to communicate your own argument. Having very different definitions or standards for certain terms means you can't really, understand, communicate, or eventually come to an understanding or at least a peaceful coexistence with the opposite side of the political spectrum. For example, sex and gender. Gender being the physical outward appearance of sex, but sex is biological. This is also distinct again from sexuality. Dawkins gives that exact same example and how he was reported to Twitter for pretty much that exact issue, where he made the point that sex is not the same as gender, yet somebody on the other side of the political spectrum, it would appear, reported it as something of a violent speech pattern or something similar. Dawkins goes through the challenges, particularly with the disconnect between language on each side of the spectrum and what this leads to. For example, having to worry about your language being perceived as something other than what it is by the opposite political spectrum members, when what you're trying to communicate and what is received are entirely separate from each other. We strongly suggest you read through this as it is a relatively enlightening article, albeit quite brief, but enlightening nonetheless. And that's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.